Okay, we're starting the seminar. Hello, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Nargiza Ludgate. I'm from University of Florida. I'm delighted to continue this webinar series dedicated to publishing best practices. The series are presented by the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems at the University of Florida Libraries. Today's webinar is called Being an Author, What Authorship Entails. In this webinar, we will focus on issues related to the authorship of scholarly journal articles. The session will cover topics such as authorship criteria, statements, responsibilities, and questionable practices. Next slide, please. I will now introduce our speaker. Dr. Terry Keith-Self is an experienced clinical investigator with specific expertise in the planning and execution of clinical trials involving mind-body therapies for chronic conditions related to aging and stress. She received a Doctor of Chiropractic degree from Palmer College of Chiropractic and a PhD in educational research from the University of Virginia. She also completed an NIH-funded postdoctoral fellowship in clinical research at the University of Virginia's Center for the Study of Complementary and Alternative Therapies. Dr. Self's research background serves her well in her current position as a translational research and impact librarian at the University of Florida. Before we start, let me share some housekeeping points for today's webinar. This webinar will go for about an hour. Please keep your microphones mute during Dr. Selfie's presentation. Please write your name, position, your institution, and your email in the chat box. The recording of the webinar will be available on the Livestock Labs website. In a minute, I will drop the link in the chat box. When you will go to the link, you will find webinar recordings and PowerPoint slides available in English and French. I will also shortly share the PowerPoint slides in French for those who can follow this presentation in French. And we were also able to enable French caption during these presentations. So please activate those and so you can see the translation in French. At the end of Dr. Selfie's presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Therefore, please write your questions and comments in the chat, which we will address at the end. Now I hand it to Dr. Self.
Thanks, Nargiza. So just on camera briefly, so you can put a face to the name. As Nargiza said, I'm Terry Self, and I will be covering a number of things around authorship. We're going to go into more detail on the authorship concepts that were briefly introduced in the last session. And then I'll move on to discuss some of the issues related to authorship. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the video now so I can focus on the slides. So if you recall from the last session, we talked about the Singapore Statement on Research Integrity, and it includes 2 items that have to do with researchers' responsibilities regarding authorship. The first states that all those and only those meeting authorship criteria should be included as authors. And then the second says that those not meeting authorship criteria, but who did contribute to the research in a significant way, should be acknowledged. And when they talk about authorship criteria, these are the 4 criteria set forth by the ICMJE. So they require that authors should have made substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data for the work. Authors should have been involved in drafting or critically revising the manuscript. They should have final approval over the version of the manuscript to be published. And they need to agree to be accountable for their work and ensure that questions related to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. To that last point, in addition to being accountable for their own contributions, they should be able to identify which co-authors are responsible for the other parts of the work and have confidence in the integrity of those contributions. These criteria are intended to reserve the status of authorship for those who deserve credit and who can take responsibility for the work. Everyone meeting all 4 of the criteria should be included as an author, and anyone not meeting all of them should not be named as an author. ICMJE goes on to say that all of the individuals who meet the first criterion should be given the opportunity to participate in the review, drafting, and final approval of the manuscript. The criteria are not intended to be used as a means to disqualify colleagues from authorship by denying them the ability to satisfy criteria 2 and 3. And again, calling back to the first session, if you'll recall, we talked about journals also having responsibilities around authorship. They're expected to have policies on authorship and contribution. So when you're authoring something, you always want to check the journal to see how they want you to present the authorship information and follow their requirements. And this is the relevant policy from the journal Livestock Science, their guide for authors. And you can see they require that each author's contributions be described using the contributor roles taxonomy or credit. The contributor roles taxonomy includes 14 roles that contributors to scholarly publications can identify. And as you'll see, they are not limited to traditional authorship roles. All relevant contributions are expected to be reported, whether they came from those named as authors or in its acknowledgments section. And I've included slides with the definitions for all 14 roles. So you've got them for future reference. I'm not going to go into every one. Some are obvious, others are less so. I'm just going to highlight a few. And remember that fulfilling One of these roles does not automatically mean someone meets the criteria to be named as an author. Okay, one of the roles is conceptualization. That's contributing ideas, research aims, and that clearly falls under that ICMJE criterion number 1, which was that substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work deserves to be named as an author. But notice the criterion says the contribution needs to be substantial, and then the individual needs to meet the other 3 criteria as well. And we'll see more about this in a bit. So another one I want to call out, another one of the roles is that funding acquisition is mentioned here, as well as project administration and provision of resources. Calling these 3 out because they are roles that sometimes raise questions. Then the last 2 on the list both have to do with writing. No matter what other contributions a person may have made to the work, at least one of these 2 must also be included in order to fulfill the ICMJE authorship criteria. Remember, criterion 2 is that they had a role in drafting or critically revising the paper. And criterion 3 says that they must have approval of the final submission. So writing is a role that has to have been included for someone to be named an author. If it wasn't clear already, an individual may have made multiple contributions to the paper, and a contributor role may have been assigned to more than one person. It is the responsibility of the corresponding author to identify the role assignments, but each contributor has the responsibility to review the assignment and confirm its accuracy. And here's an example of what a credit statement looks like. Again, this is an example from livestock science. And I redacted the author's names. Note that only the roles relevant to the work are included. While there are 14 credit roles, all 14 do not need to be addressed in a contribution statement. And the other thing I want to point out here is they state this as an authorship contribution statement. That being the case, since all of these are authors, you expect to see one of the roles having to do with writing, and you do see that. Author 1 was involved in the original draft. Authors 2 and 3 were both involved in reviewing and editing. Even with the ICMJE criteria and the credit roles, Assigning authorship is not always a clear-cut issue. And I've included this graphic from the NIH, National Institutes of Health guidelines for authorship contributions. Many of the contributions fall into shades of gray. For example, contributing to the data analysis is typically considered to meet the first criterion. However, the NIH notes that very basic analysis would not meet the standard. On the other hand, some contributions are a clear yes or no for authorship. Drafting the manuscript clearly warrants authorship, and those without any writing contribution should not be named as authors. For NIH, simply contributing the funds for the research does not entitle someone to authorship of the resulting papers. That's noted up here. If that was the only contribution made by an individual, it would be more appropriately recognized in the acknowledgments section. So we talked about shades of gray. Now we're looking at some clearly inappropriate authorship assignments. The first three listed here, gift, honorary, and guest authorship, are variations on the theme of authorship being inappropriately assigned to someone who made no significant contribution to the work. The last example is the opposite problem. Someone who did make a significant contribution was not acknowledged. In this case, it's often a professional writer, and the concern with them not being acknowledged is that that may have been done in order to conceal a potential conflict of interest on their part. So under the inappropriate assignments where the person did not make a contribution, they go by different names. Sometimes these are used interchangeably, but generally speaking, gift authorship is typically used when the person was named more as a I'll do this for you if you do something else for me type of situation. Sometimes one author, I'll put you on my paper with the expectation that you'll name me on your paper. Honorary authorship is typically referring to naming someone as an author because they're in a position senior to you, not because they actually contributed to the paper. And guest authorship, here they're getting at people naming others as authors because having that individual's name on the paper might improve their chances of the paper being published, or might improve the article's impact. given the fact that the authorship criteria leave room for interpretation, and members of the study team may have differing authorship expectations, disputes can arise. To try to avoid disputes, early on in the research planning process, discuss articles that you think will result from the research and which team members will be involved in authoring those papers. I suggest using the ICMJE criteria and the credit roles to frame that discussion and help keep it objective. Also, be sure to check the instructions for authors provided by the journal that you wish to publish in, because the journals can have specific authorship criteria that may vary from one journal to another. So in this example, again, from livestock science, in addition to the information on author contributions that we've already talked about, they also have a section on guidance regarding changes in authorship. So making changes to authorship is a big deal. You really need to have decided on authorship well in advance. While you may be able to change the author order or add or delete an author before the manuscript is accepted for publication, it's frowned upon, and you'll probably need to jump through some hoops in order to accomplish this. According to this policy from the publisher Elsevier, these changes to authorship will only be considered in exceptional circumstances. And we're going to see this same language again when we discuss the issue of authorship for sale. So when we're talking about issues with authorship, one of the newer areas of authorship policy involves the use of artificial intelligence assisted technologies in the writing of articles. ICMJE says that authors should be required to disclose any use of AI and describe how it was used. Unfortunately, AI is known to sometimes generate inaccurate output. So the authors must diligently review anything produced by AI. Also, AI cannot be credited as an author. Some authorship responsibilities can only be undertaken by humans. The authors are responsible for the accuracy, integrity, and originality of the work, and they must ensure there's appropriate attribution of all quoted material. And going back to Livestock Sciences Guide for Authors, they have a section addressing AI as well. The publisher's policy allows for the use of AI in the writing process, but only to improve readability and language. And consistent with the ICMJE recommendations, they require authors to disclose any use of AI, be accountable for the contents, and they to assert that AI cannot be listed as an author. Here's an example of an inappropriate use of AI. This is text from an article published in a peer-reviewed journal. As you can see, the section discussing recent studies on future prospects for sustainable agricultural development says, quote, "As an AI language model, I don't have real-time access to current studies or research papers," end quote. So this whole paragraph was clearly written with the use of AI, and somehow this whole piece made it into the final published version. The authors missed it, the peer reviewers missed it, and the editorial staff missed it. It makes you wonder about the rest of the article as well. How much of it was generated by AI? Did anyone check the content for accuracy? Did the manuscript actually undergo peer review or any kind of quality assessment? And if so, what else did they miss? So this raises concerns around, I mean, this is clearly an authorship issue, but it's also a peer review and an editorial issue. Looking at the journal that the publication was in, I noticed 2 articles in the same journal had the same issue. So that one article was not alone in having that same issue. And part of the problem may be, as you can see, the guide for authors. This is a snip of the like whole section on guide for authors. It's extremely brief, and their section on publication ethics is even less informative. So there isn't really a policy stated by this journal about use of AI. Even so, the authors are ultimately responsible for the content of their article. I don't think that they can use the lack of guidance from the journal as an excuse. I will say, if I was looking for a journal in which to publish an article of my own, I would not be inclined to choose this journal because I don't have any confidence in their peer review or editorial processes based on what I saw from that other article. So just a reminder that when you're thinking about where you want to publish, we're going to be in a future session, we'll be touching upon things you can do to find reputable journals. One of those things is read some of the other articles they have published. It'll give you a better sense of what kind of peer review and editorial control an article you submit would receive. Another current issue around authorship is sometimes referred to as authorship for sale. There are paper mills that will create fake research and generate articles to be published in legitimate journals and then sell authorship on those articles to researchers that are just wanting to add a publication to their CV. So a common process for paper mills is that paper is written by the paper mill staff. It's submitted to a number of different journals. Once the paper is accepted in principle or starts the revision process in one of those journals, the other papers are abandoned. That provisionally accepted paper is then listed on the paper mill site or advertised in other places. And people can buy an authorship position on that paper. The prices for the authorship will vary based on the position in the list that the authors want to be on. So like the lead author would be the highest priced. Also, the higher the impact factor of the journal, the higher price. And so that alone is issue enough, but this is compounded by the fact that once a paper mill identifies a journal and successfully gets a paper published, then they follow up sometimes with hundreds of more submissions to that same journal. So it's not just an issue for authors, it's becoming a big issue for the journals as well. And here's a case that was discussed on the COPE website, the Council on Publication Ethics. They note that this type of thing is increasingly common, and that early career researchers are often unaware of the nature of these services. They suggest that promoting awareness of paper mills and similar services a- and the role they play in publication fraud is the most constructive means of addressing the problem of authorship for sale. So sometimes these paper mills can, especially for early career researchers, they may come across as offering legitimate services, sometimes things like translation services. So that's something we really need to make researchers aware of. Here is one publisher's response to the problem, and that was to institute a new restrictive policy regarding the addition of authors to manuscripts. So this goes back to that a previous slide where we were talking about making changes to authorship is frowned upon. This helps explain why that's the case. So for this publisher, under their new policy, authorship changes are only allowed in exceptional circumstances. That's the same language that we saw earlier. And they require in-depth assessment from their research integrity unit. And after instituting this policy, that has resulted in some articles that were previously published undergoing scrutiny and being retracted. So we talked about getting listed as an author because you paid for that. Here's a different issue. This is being listed as an author because you just made it up. So this is a case inspired by a true story. They changed the name and some of the details. So this was a department chair who was found to have made false claims in his CV for his job application and also in his bio sketch for NIH grant applications. NIH was notified of this by the chancellor of the institution where the researcher worked. And the Office of Research Integrity knew about the allegations, but they weren't pursuing it because falsified credentials are not defined as research misconduct. However, NIH can go after this type of thing in grant applications because it's an attempt to violate peer review integrity. In this particular case, the researcher's current grants from NIH were discontinued and his applications were withdrawn. The researcher had resigned from the institution that reported him and was working at another university. But when news reporters contacted the second university, he left there as well. So this is a bit of an extreme example, but as I say, this was based on a true case. So there can be substantial repercussions to doing that kind of falsification, claiming authorship when you didn't actually author the paper. And while that was just one example, studies suggest that embellishment of credentials in job applications is widespread. Looking at how prevalent CV falsification is, one older study showed 15.6% of applicants for clinical faculty positions had falsified publications on their CVs. And a more recent study, the one cited here, looked at the incidence and type of CV falsification in applicants for non-health science faculty positions this was just one large university with high research productivity. They collected all the CVs submitted by applicants for faculty positions in non-health science programs at the university and reviewed 10% of them for accuracy. Overall, in that study, 56% of all the CVs were found to have questionable publications. Most commonly, the issues were they were unable to verify an article. There were also books or book chapters that they were unable to verify. Some of the types of inaccuracies were around authorship order. Either they had listed themselves as an author on a paper that they weren't found to be listed on at all, or they promoted themselves in the author order. For example, listing themselves as a first author when they were not the first author, or omitting other authors from the citation. So it looked like there were fewer authors involved, making their contribution look larger. The authors of the study discussed some hypotheses for why this might happen. So some might just be honest mistakes. On a multi-author paper, author order might have been miscommunicated by the lead author. The person writing their CV might not be familiar with how to categorize a publication. For example, when a publication is considered accepted for publication versus when it is only considered under review. Or it could be some combination of not really understanding the terms, along with delays in completing revisions. And on the other hand, some of these might be the result of deliberate actions. In the paper, they refer to them as little lies that the researcher knows are not true at the time, but hopes they will be true by the time someone reviews the CV, or big lies that are told just to be competitive. And finally, as one person put it, some scientists are psychopaths. Here are a few suggestions aimed at helping you avoid the honest mistakes related to authorship claims. First off, when listing your publications, make sure the information you provide matches what the published version of the article says. Author order might have changed from what you might have been using from a draft version. You want to be sure that what you put on your CV is consistent with what a search committee member sees if they access any of those publications you listed. Secondly, be sure you're using the publication status terms correctly. Become familiar with what they mean and report the current status of the publication at the time you submit the CV. I've listed some of the common publication terms, so you can hopefully avoid misrepresenting the status of your articles. I'm not going to go over all of these. For one thing, it's also potentially a language issue here, but I have hit the common terms and have linked to a document that goes into further detail. And I've given some examples of how you might apply this. So one place to get current status information for submitted manuscripts is in the manuscript submission system itself. So this example of an article shows the status of the manuscript as under review. So that is what you would want to state in your CV. Another way to determine the current status is to check all of the email communications received from the editor. The emails will be dated, and they typically have the title of the manuscript and usually a manuscript ID number that they've assigned. This example also provides a link to the manuscript submission system that you could use as well. And then you would just go through the email looking for the status terms. In this example here, it says that the manuscript was successfully submitted, but it does not say it's been sent out for review. So what you would safely say about this one is that you would list it as having been submitted. Here's an example from a different journal for a different article. This one also references the manuscript title and an ID number and provides a link to the submission system. And here I've underlined the wording related to status. While the word acceptable appears, potentially acceptable is not the same as accepted. It might be accepted after some revisions. So as of January 13th, the most you could comfortably say about this manuscript is that it's under review. And here's an email from January 21st for that same article. Again, you would scan for status language, and here you see congratulations on the acceptance of your article, and that they'll be in touch. So this is the first date where you could say that that manuscript was accepted for publication. And it looks like I've got that flipping through. And I've also included, this was just a case showing that questionable practices around authorship are not restricted to individual researchers. This is a case from COPE about institutions paying authors to be named on papers. I was surprised when I first saw this, but apparently this behavior is relatively common. So know that as an author, you could potentially be approached by an institution requesting that you add them as an affiliation. Also know the editors are aware of this, and they may ask you for proof that you're actually affiliated with the institutions that you list. It is really not worth sacrificing your integrity to do this. So this session, I provide some resources that can be useful in determining authorship. We talked about the assignment of authorship, handling disputes, and identified some current issues related to authorship, including the use of AI and paper mills, and then just some additional resources. And I will turn it over to Nargiza.
Thank you very much, Terry. This was very interesting. We have a couple of questions in the chat. We will review those, and then if there will be time, we may encourage some of you to unmute and ask a question if you wish. So there was a question on what the ICMGE stand for, and I put the meaning of this abbreviation, but would you like to explain a little bit more why you were referencing this committee? Is it a gold standard?
Yeah, it is. So it's the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. So they have a set of recommendations, and we talked about those in the last session. They are, yes, they are the gold standard for content, specifically for medical journals, but I think their reach is broader than that. So they have, the reason I called them out in this particular session is they're the ones that laid out those 4 criteria that we discussed in depth. They're the source of those, and any journals that have membership and say that they comply with ICMJE standards are expected to apply those criteria for any articles they publish.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of questions related to AI. So one is if you could explain the use of AI in writing articles.
Very basically. I laughed about the questions about AI because, yeah, I'm right there with you. There are lots of questions about AI. AI is not really my area. I haven't I haven't used it myself. What I know is what I'm most familiar with is the use of what they call generative AI. So things like chatbots. One of the names, like Chat GPT. If you've heard of chatbots or Chat GPT, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. And apparently, you can you can pose a question to a chatbot, and it will give you an answer. Unfortunately, the answers provided are not always based on credible facts. So sometimes what AI responds to a question is wrong, which is why they're cautioning that if you do use it at all, it needs to be used in a limited manner, and you, as the human author, are responsible for making sure that anything that is said is accurate, and that it wasn't. The other thing that sometimes happens is they can just, you ask the question of AI, it finds a source and it just quotes the source without telling you what source they're quoting, which is plagiarism. And if you're the human author and you didn't check that, you're the one who's going to be held accountable for that. If you ended up including something you just took from AI and it was plagiarized information.
Thank you, Terry. We have about 3 minutes, and there are a couple of questions. The first one is, I think that authorship for sale is legally allowed according to this presentation. What is a drawback? What is a drawback of authorship for sale?
So this becomes problematic. Trying to go back to what happens is people are claiming authorship to be named as an author. To meet authorship criteria, you have to have been involved in writing the article, for one thing, which authorship for sale, you're not doing. It's somebody else wrote the article. You had absolutely nothing to do with it. You just purchased the someone to put your name, you just added your name as an author. You never had anything to do with the article itself. So you didn't do the writing, which is a requirement for authorship. You also didn't have anything. The first criterion for authorship was to actually have been substantial contribution to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data for the work. So you had absolutely nothing to do with the work and nothing to do with the writing. So you do not meet the authorship criteria. So you're claiming something that, according to these criteria, you are not entitled to. And that's the issue.
Okay, thank you, Terry. We are a minute away. If you could take me to the last slides, because we need to wrap up this webinar. Thank you. Before we go, I wanted to share information on the next webinar, which is on November 3rd, and it's called Being Transparent, Principles of Transparency in Scholarly Publishing. The webinar will be at the same time, 8 a.m. US Eastern Standard Time. The Zoom link will be the same. We look forward to seeing you in this webinar. Thank you very much for your participation, and the recordings of this webinar and the webinar from October 6th will be available hopefully next week. Thank you for joining. Goodbye.